Welcome to Beyond the Fundamentals. In this video, we're going to do something different that we typically don't do here. We're going to show a video from somebody else's channel, and there's a reason that I want to show that video. I'll go ahead and tell you what that video is. There was a video on Jordan Peterson's channel where he's talking to Iain McGilchrist, and Iain McGilchrist wrote a book called The Matter with Things. And if you don't know this, Iain McGilchrist is most famous for his book, The Master and His Emissary, in which he shows the two hemispheres of the brain, and where the right hemisphere should be the master and the left hemisphere should be the emissary, but we get it swapped around, we get it backwards. Now, why is this relevant? The only reason I'm doing this info is so I can try to help you see just real quickly why this is relevant. Couple reasons. In the immediate context, I'm going to be doing a review video of this portion that I'm going to show here. And I'm going to have Nick come on from Wednesday nights. I'm going to have Nick come on, and we're going to have a discussion about this video. So one of the reasons I'm showing it here is so that you can watch it here first, so that you can follow that discussion better, okay? The second reason is this channel is probably most famously known for the stuff that we do refuting Calvinism, right? Now, one of the things that we get a lot of kickback for is when you look at the problem of Calvinism, when you look at any problem that seems like it's difficult to solve. For example, they'll say, well, this is being debated for centuries and centuries and centuries. Well, the problem is that whenever you have a problem that's difficult to solve, typically you are framing it too narrowly, okay? So one of the things we've been doing on this channel is we have been broadening the scope of consideration for what is the cause of the Calvinist problem. And as we broaden the scope, we find lots of causes that result in things like Calvinism, and Calvinism is just one anomaly. It is just one artifact in an entire array of causes that are producing ideological possession within the church, okay? Now, with regard to the meaning crisis, and on this channel we've done the faith crisis, and we talked about Mammon Church, okay? And I think most of us understand there's something very bad wrong with the modern church today. And so what we're trying to do is as we broaden the scope to define the problem better, this video, in my opinion, has great information that helps us define one of the core causes of artifacts like Calvinism, of that kind of, cognitive instability and cognitive incapacity in people, so that they get duped and deceived by things like this, by Calvinism, and so when you look at the causes, when you make the scope bigger, you see that Calvinism, provisionism, traditionalism, Arminianism, they all have the same problems. They're all artifacts of the same problem, and that problem is the domination of the left hemisphere over the right hemisphere, okay? And when you learn what the functions of the different hemispheres are, it helps us no matter what you're doing. Now, the discussion that's being had here is society at large, but as Christians, we see the exact same problems that are plaguing Christians, plaguing the church as well. It's the same kind of problems. It's domination of the left hemisphere. And so when you look into some of these things, we're dominated now by what you might describe as this left hemisphere reduced ideological view of the world. And so here's a couple of things that stood out to me in the transcript that I'm just going to highlight for you. I want you to listen for this kind of thing. So what I want you to listen for is, when you think of the left hemisphere, I want you to think of it as the tendency to over-systematize everything and make a map of everything, and the map that it makes is not reality, okay? What do you mean make a map of everything? Well, you'll take the Bible, for example, okay? And then you'll try to make a map of it that looks something like this. Well, we've got the map of it. And what we will learn while we're watching this video is that if something is not in the map, your left hemisphere acts like it doesn't even exist. So if you can, you've all experienced this, especially if you watch this channel. You find something in the Bible, you go to your church, you try to tell your friends, your pastor, something like that about this thing you found in the Bible. But if it's not already in something like this, and it's not already talked about by Brother Melms or by the great giants of the faith, church, all the way back to the church babies, then they don't know what to do with it. They have no idea what to do with it, and they wind up finding a way to get you to leave or to shut up or something like that because they don't know how to respond to novelty. That's because they only exist in the left hemisphere of the brain. So as Christians, as we are facing this issue, it is not this narrowly defined problem of, oh, just somebody's interpreting a Bible verse different than somebody else. No, it is a much broader problem than that. So we are on a journey on this channel. We want to understand what the problem really is. I know some of you come here just for like tit for tat Calvinist stuff. You just want an answer to this. You just want a good explanation to for how do I bolster eternal security using this kind of stuff. And you guys, you're thinking that way. You're part of the problem. You're not part of the solution. And so what we ultimately want to do is discover and practice a set of practices and activities that will help us live in the right hemisphere while we use the left hemisphere to help grasp things, but don't let the left hemisphere dominate. And a very interesting thing that comes out of this is how what Jordan Peterson calls the Luciferian presumption. He compares the left hemisphere's desire to want to take over the right hemispheric function as a Luciferian presumption. It's the attempt to replace the context by the part. Okay, so if you think of the gestalt and then the component, or the large thing versus the small thing, like a car versus the head gasket, something like that. We get so focused and preoccupied and obsessed with the head gasket or with the spark plug or with the valve stem that we forget the whole of the car. Okay, that kind of thing. So when it comes, thinking that it's, oh, they're interpreting this like you think that if I show them how to really interpret John 6:44, that will solve their problem and end that argument. No, because wrongly interpreting John 6:44 isn't what caused their Calvinism, you see? Wrongly interpreting John 3:16 and Romans 9, and none of that stuff caused their Calvinism. Those are all byproducts of their Calvinism. If you really want to join this fight and do it well, and I probably shouldn't call it a fight because we're trying to maximize non-rivalry, but we are fighting against ourselves, and we're fighting against our own infirmities, our own incapacities to do cognition well. If you really want to be part of the solution, really is what I'm trying to say, you need to understand the problem, all right? And if you think the Calvinistic problem is because they don't know how to interpret verses, you don't understand the problem. And as many people have said, a problem well defined is half solved. Well, attacking Calvinism with something like provisionism is to fail to understand the problem, and that's why it's never going to get solved. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand the problem. So we need to understand something a little bit how the human body works. So our tendency, our institutions, if you have a statement of faith, your institutions, your systematic theology, your concept of orthodoxy, all that kind of stuff, guess what? It's left hemisphere stuff. And it is some kind of tyranny. So you got Luciferian. What it does is it's mechanistic, it's reductionistic, it's algorithmic. It privileges theory over reality. The Luciferian presumptions are the untrammeled intellect, Peterson says, and it's associated with this idea of the left hemisphere domination. It's a hyper-systematized at the context at the cost of the whole, right? Which is what's going on. And this happens outside of Calvinism. It also happens in provisionism. It happens everywhere. There is that denial. Is that one of the key features of the left hemisphere. In other words, the left hemisphere will just deny things that do not fit into its map. Okay. If the right hemisphere detects an anomaly, it'll say, "Hey, the map no longer matches the territory. Let's update things." Well, when you're doing Mammon Church, okay, when you're following something like Calvinism or provisionism that's propositionally tyrannizing, you have a statement of faith, all this kind of stuff, you're not going to solve that problem. You're not going to be able to update that map, especially 2 and 3 generations after. You are not going to be able to do that. The left hemisphere has no choice but to impose its axiomatic presumptions when there's nothing indicating the lack, and there's no pathway forward to a new representation That is a problem. So we need to fix that before you can fix Calvinism. You understand? Then the left hemisphere will insist that the pre-theory is the only one that abides. Okay? These kinds of statements stand out to me in what you're about to hear. If it's gone from the left hemisphere's attention, it ceases to exist. That's why no matter what you find in the Bible, if you're dealing with someone who's, in their left hemisphere, like a Calvinist or a provisionist, if you can't find it in something like this, they're just going to act like it doesn't exist and like it doesn't matter. I don't need the four kinds to know anything. Okay, left hemisphere domination. That's what's going on there. There's anxiety associated with this. There's desire for certainty, all connected with control. Those kinds of things are associated with all that and lead to things like Calvinism and provisionism. And it leads toward intolerance and effectively things that can't be talked about. Notice how there's like an orthodoxy heresy thing, and if you say the wrong thing, you're a heretic. I have to watch what I say on this channel because there's constantly people trying to map me to things that I'm going to be a heretic because the left hemispheric type of religion that you people are in who complain when I have someone like Seraphim Winslow on here, you got this left hemisphere, you have this intolerance and you want to use a kind of moralism to not tolerate the exploration of the right hemispheric mind into unknown territory because you don't know how to handle novelty. You think nobody else does. Therefore, you have to pre-classify it all as satanic or new age or something like that. Okay. And we have to stop that. We have to stop that. It becomes purely meaningless, purposeless, mechanistic, and then we tend to commodify and instrumentalize things. And then there's also some talk about some attentional capacity there too. Now we're going to do a follow-up video with this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and get into this video. We are now going to watch. I have titled this segment here, the Luciferian left hemisphere, okay? The Luciferian left hemisphere. And so I invite you to watch this, and after this video gets some views, and me and Nick are going to come on, Nick and I are going to come on, and we're going to do a video discussing some of the contents that are in this video. And so that's why I'm putting this out there now so that you have access to it. I've taken the time to add subtitles to it. I paid a company to do that, so the subtitles aren't perfect. Okay, so don't crucify me for that. But I'm trying my hardest to get you to grasp this information in every way that I know how. So instead of just referencing the video on the other channel, I'm putting it on this one. I'm putting it with subtitles, trying to do everything that I can to put these cookies on the lower shelf. And then afterwards, we're going to have a conversation where we break this down. We're going to go live probably in about a week or so where we break this down. We want everybody to get this because you need to understand the nature of the problem that we're up against within Christianity. All right, so without further ado, as James White would say, here is Jordan Peterson and Iain McGilchrist talking about the left and right hemisphere.
So Iain, in some sense, I hate to do this, but since we are trying to build Jacob's ladder all the way down to the level of detail, maybe we could delve a little bit more into the practical necessity of such knowledge. So why do you think this matters in the concrete sense? And why do you think that we're dominated now by what you might describe as this left hemisphere reduced ideological view of the world?
Yes, I may well have compiled one of the most comprehensive analyses of hemisphere differences in the 450 pages of the first part of this book. But it's not just of technical interest. It seems to me to be part of a very important overall philosophical project. As I explained, we don't know how to evaluate different things. I have a whole chapter on paradoxes, by the way, in which one can see that one arm of a paradox comes from the left hemisphere and one from the right hemisphere. And guess what? The one that comes from the right hemisphere actually describes what we know to be real. Anyway, to pan back a bit, I feel that there is something. I think we all know that there's something amiss with the vision we have of the world at the moment, and that's the other meaning of the title, The Matter with Things. And the subtitle is Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. And I think we're unmaking the world in several respects. One is very familiar, which is the despoliation, destruction, desecration of the natural world, of forests, of seas, and so forth, and the consequences that that will have for us. But another is a complete misunderstanding of the human being, who is now seen as a kind of a machine, perhaps even not a very efficient machine. Perhaps it would be better if we were hybridized with a machine. All of this speaks to me of something that is profoundly missing the meaning of a human being and a human life. And we seem to have lost our compass. We seem to have lost all bearings. And part of this is, I think, because we are dominated by the way in which the left hemisphere sees the world. The left hemisphere, after all, helps you grab stuff, but it doesn't do anything else in terms of helping you understand it. The understanding of the world comes from the right hemisphere, but it's the left hemisphere that makes you rich, powerful for a while. And it always seems to take over just as a civilization goes into tailspin and declines. So you see this with the acquisition of two great territory in both the Greek and the Roman civilizations. And you see it again with the expansionism of the West in the last 150, 200 years since the Enlightenment. And what seems to happen is that partly because of the necessity of administering a huge realm, whether that be a military realm or a civil realm or a commercial realm, that requires the generation of rather rigid inhuman rules that can be applied in all situations, and therefore the takeover of essentially the bureaucratic mind. It's not to oversimplify to say that what many of the troubles that we have now are because of the extraordinary expansion of the bureaucratic vision of the world, in which the human is left out. And it's not caused, I think, by a sinister cabal. The paranoid idea that there's a group of people who are really wanting to control the rest of us. I mean, I can't rule it out, but I think much more likely, from my experience in life, I believe that there are more cock-ups than there are conspiracies.
Yes,
and that
yes.
And that in this particular case, it's something that is bigger than all of us, including those members of government, administrative bodies, bureaucracies, themselves. They are the victims of this same thing.
Well, you're talking about it as a neurological proclivity in some sense, which is way deeper and more profound than any mere manifestation. Let me ask you a mythological question.
Okay.
So I've been spending a lot of time trying to unpack the story of the Tower of Babel. And so what happens after the catastrophe of Cain and Abel in Genesis is you get two negative outcomes, let's say sinful existence, and one would be the chaotic flood that envelops Noah, and the other and so that's like the catastrophe of the natural world gone completely uncontrollable. The next is the catastrophe of the bureaucratic state. And so the Tower of Babel is an attempt to replace the heavenly hierarchy by a human creation. And the consequence of that is the destruction of the ability to communicate. And so what happens is that fundamental perceptual categories, perceptual and linguistic categories become, what would you say, they become unstable as this top-heavy administrative process develops. And it is an element of Luciferian presumption. It's the attempt to replace the context by the part.
I think it is. And it's interesting that even Adorno back in the 40s was describing what he saw then as the administered world, die verwaltete Welt, he said, which is, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm just talking about bureaucracy, but bureaucracy as an image of a whole way of thinking, which is the mechanistic one, the reductionist one, the one that
the algorithmic
one that there are rules and so on. And what this does is it privileges the theory over the reality.
Yeah, well, that's what the postmodernists do non-stop,
has fallen, as has been pointed out, experience has fallen in value, and instead theories about how life should be have become the reality. And this is something that you notice in bureaucracies, that actually having ticked the box is more important than the event in the real world, which that was supposed to, to evaluate. So, for example, in medicine, it's quite possible to do extremely good medicine, but if it's not catalogued in a certain way and certain boxes weren't ticked, it doesn't count and it didn't happen. So,
well, and I do think it is important, as you point out, it's extremely important to note that this is a deeper problem than merely that which is manifested by any of its manifestations,
exactly,
right? We don't want to blame the bureaucrats, and the notion that there's an evil cabal, well, there is the World Economic Forum, and they might count, but fundamentally, we're looking at something that's much more profound, and it is something like, I do think it's something that's represented in Christianity, for example, as the Luciferian presumptions of the untrammeled intellect. And it is associated with this idea of left hemisphere domination. It's hyper-systematization at the cost of the whole.
Yes, I think that's right. And one thing that struck me very much in the last few years is that the myth of the master and his emissary, on which the title of the first book, or the earlier book, is based, is something that actually crops up all around the world, that there is a wise ruler and there is an intemperate, hot-headed general or underling who actually is put out by the feeling that there is this more powerful being, and actually wants to usurp that being.
Yeah, very common theme.
But there actually this precise myth of there being two beings, one of them that is willing to take under its aegis the other and to allow it to work well, but that other doesn't want that. Like Satan in Milton's Paradise
absolutely,
Lost.
Absolutely.
It is a very expression of resentment, envy, and the desire to destroy if it cannot own something. And this seems to me really important element in the picture that we're looking at.
Yeah, well, I think it's the crucial element. And I think you're putting your finger on Milton's Lucifer is absolutely perfect. I thought about Milton in relationship to the rise of totalitarian states. And so Milton was writing about Luciferian presumption before totalitarian states in the modern sense really came into being. And one of the things that his poetic genius intuited was that our Luciferian intellectual presumptions would entice us into producing representational systems that would then attempt to replace the territory with the map, and to privilege epistemology and to privilege this narrow rationality that you're describing above all, and then also to insist upon that representation and that replacement. You really saw this with the Soviets, right? Where the Soviets and the Maoists, they were so insistent that their representation replaced reality that it became criminal to admit that you were suffering. It's like, you can't be hungry, the state is perfect.
Yes, oh yes.
And in Venezuela, they've made it illegal. In Venezuela, they made it illegal to list starvation as a cause of death by physicians.
Oh, wow. But what fascinates me there is that denial is one of the key features of the left hemisphere's take on the world. And it's so striking in medical cases that people who've had a right hemisphere stroke will claim that black is white. They will just deny that a completely, obviously, uselessly paralyzed limb is fully under their control and they can move it and there isn't anything wrong at all.
Well, so in keeping with your notion and Goldberg's notion of the right hemisphere, let's say, as an anomaly detection system. So imagine this. You know what happens when you have a tooth pulled, hey? It takes your tongue, and it'll do this all by itself, like 3 months of exploratory work to map out that new crevice. And so you imagine that your left hemisphere or there's a representation of that section of your mouth that's unbelievably highly detailed. And then you upset it, and now there's an anomaly detected by the right. It says, there's something here where the map no longer matches the territory. And then there's all this exploratory work that has to be done in order to map out the contours of the mouth. And the mouth is really relevant because, the mouth and the tongue are unbelievably thoroughly represented at a neurological level. And so like it takes 6 months or 3 months of constant busy work to refamiliarize yourself just with the inside of your mouth. So now let's say you have right hemisphere damage in the parietal lobe and you lose half your body, but you don't notice. And I think the reason you don't notice is because the left has no choice but to impose its axiomatic presumptions when there's nothing indicating the lack and there's no pathway forward to a new representation. I've seen people who, I had a cousin who got really ill and she was diabetic and she had a lot of immunological problems and she had to radically modify her whole life to deal with what she could and couldn't eat. And she didn't do a very good job of it. And my parents and other people, her relatives, were often upset with her. Not so much my parents specifically, but many people who knew her were hurt and upset with her because they felt that she was denying her illness. But I thought, man, if something happens to you that's cataclysmic and it changes your entire identity in an extraordinarily complex manner, it can take you months to years to readapt. 3 months just to remap your tooth. And then the left will insist that the pre-theory is the only one that abides.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it doesn't happen the other way around. So you can have just as cataclysmic event like your right arm is paralyzed and you don't deny it at all. In fact, you're appropriately upset about it. So it is something to do with the left hemisphere's way of understanding things. And what is really fascinating is that when something is not there, and there are these descriptions of patients who simply won't recognize the existence of half of their body and fail to dress it or shave it. But they also, as pointed out by Tsengele, cannot imagine that there ever was a left half of their body or that there ever will be again in the future. In other words, once it's gone from the left hemisphere's attention, it ceases to exist. So it's not
it's not even not there. I know, it's so strange.
It's not as though this... It's not as though this left hemisphere tendency is simply to deny something. It simply doesn't believe that it exists. So, and when you put that on the cultural situation at the moment, it begins to cast some light on how people who can't be that stupid and who can't be that perverse nonetheless argue that black is white, you know?
Yeah. Well, I've been trying to think, I've tried to think about the phenomenology of neglect a lot, you know, because it is such a weird thing that people even lose the notion that what is absent. So it's not even not there. It's a category we can't even comprehend. But imagine, so you look straight ahead, and you move your hands to the side like this. And what happens is, when your hands are in front of your eyes, they're pretty high resolution. And then when you move them this way, they get lower and lower resolution. And then they get black and white out here, although you can't tell that, but scientific investigations have shown that. And then about here, they just cease to exist. And so I'm kind of wondering if that sense of neglect phenomenologically is akin to having that which is in our visual field behind us now moved 3/4 of the way around instead of halfway around.
I'm not sure I'd say that.
Okay.
I think there's a distinction between not being able to see something but knowing that it's there. And the right hemisphere doesn't engage in this kind of denial at all. It's perfectly aware that it can't see something or it, you know. But the left hemisphere, for the left hemisphere, if it isn't in the map, as it were, then it doesn't exist. It's not on the map, so it can't be real. And that's
deconstructionism in a nutshell, right? Is this privileging of epistemology.
It's imaged throughout various movements in the history of ideas in our lifetime, is getting more and more extreme, so that people's theory about what the world should be like is now the only reality. And if things don't conform to it, it's because some terrible people have been deliberately trying to frustrate it.
Right. Well, so do you have some sense sociologically why this has intensified as of late? Like, is it a necessary consequence of our scientific and technological prowess and the philosophy that's come along with that? And do you think technology is accelerating this in some sense?
Well, I think our success in technology has led us to believe that we understand all sorts of things that we probably understand less well than at any other time in human history. We may know more technically about them, but we don't really understand what's going on or what the meaning or value or purpose of these elements in the world is or are. And I think that's part of it. The fact is that when you begin to see the world as meaningless and purely mechanistic, then you lose the sense of value, and it's extremely distressing. So it causes an epidemic of anxiety and depression, and that's something that we can see the evidence of all around us. And when people are anxious and depressed like that, they must have certainties. They cling to false certainties, and they'd rather cling to a certainty that's clearly wrong than face the fact that they really don't. They're disorientated. So anything that comes along that becomes the element, and particularly important, is something that offers control.
Yes,
because anxiety it's out of control. It's terrifying. I feel, quote, unsafe. I mean, how often do we hear that these days? I mean, ridiculously enough, but we do. But the great thing there is we have to get control back, and that leads towards intolerance and effectively things that can't be talked about. And the foundations, as Hannah Arendt said, as Simone Weil said, of totalitarianism.
Okay, so imagine, I'll take a bit of a detour here to talking to Sam Harris. And so Harris is a reductive rationalist, and he believes in algorithmic processing. He doesn't believe in free will. And one of the things that's happened that's really interesting to Harris, and I'm saying this with all due respect, I really like Sam, and he's really smart, and I think his orientation is fundamentally good. But what's so interesting to see what's happened to him practically is that he's really abandoned his rational atheism in a phenomenological sense to pursue meditation. And he's developed this meditation app, which is his central focus now, and he's teaching people all over the world to meditate. And what I see happening is that he's taking a respite from the narrow confines of his reductive materialism in the world of the transcendent right hemisphere. And he wants to keep that non-linguistic. And that's sort of the Buddhist twist on that, because if it was propositionalized and transferred into something like a comprehensible religion, then his intellect would just criticize it out of existence. But he finds respite and succor in these practices that I think produce a right hemisphere revelation of harmony and totality and love and all of that. And then you might imagine that absent that proper relationship between the left and the right, so you can't find respite from your narrow preoccupations and your doubt in a relationship with the right. You have to start to depend on ideological certainty as a buffer against the anxiety, because you're not properly integrated in the part of the contextual understanding that would lead you to genuine meaning. And that's where that immersement meaning is like an antidote to anxiety. Absent that, you have to occupy a narrower and narrower certainty to keep yourself from panicking in some sense.
Well, our attention is so fragmented nowadays because it's valuable and is therefore being grabbed at by so many different sources all day long that we're no longer able to pay the sort of sustained, vigilant, non-verbal, non-judgmental openness of attention, which is the very business of mindfulness to try and nourish.
Right.
I think that people are gravitating to this because in it, for the first time, they can begin to see a world that makes sense. Because, as I say, everything depends on the attention. If your attention is fragmented and is making presumptions about what you're seeing, that it's purely meaningless, purposeless, and mechanistic, then you are trapped into something. And I suppose that what he is trying to do there is to say this is a way in which we can open that up. And I think that's welcome. I suppose I always worry about people adopting spiritual practices, as it were, for utilitarian purposes. But sometimes it's better that they adopt them and then see what comes of that than that they don't adopt them at all. I think it's a mistake to, for example, to think that the point of meditating is to lower your blood pressure and make your mind work faster so that you can be a better stockbroker. And that is really not, that is to misunderstand this process that you're entering into. And it's typically to do what the left hemisphere always does, which is to turn it into a commodity.
Right, to instrumentalize it. Yes,
instrumentalize it, exactly.
Yes. Well, a lot of these bureaucratic enterprises and ideological enterprises are also characterized by the instrumentalization of everything. And the problem with that, in some sense, is that instrumentalization, which would be a left hemisphere function, is extremely useful if you have a narrow, goal-directed necessity in mind and you need to undertake it efficiently and in a short period of time. Yeah. But if the question of, well, what's all this for in the broader sense comes up, then that kind of attention interferes with the apprehension that would allow you to conceive of the broader context. And I think there's a couple of things that are really key in importance in what we've been discussing that people should perhaps contemplate in a deep sense. And one is your insistence, which dovetails, I would say, with my insistence, that there isn't, in some sense, anything more important than trying to understand the processes by which attention is directed. There's something absolute, the Egyptian god Horus, that eye that everyone knows, the falcon that was Horus, that is that attentional capacity that you described. And they worship that as the redemptive god himself, like the eye of Horus. Horus was the god who redeemed the dead state and who fought off Seth. And Seth eventually turns into Satan, by the way, via the Coptics. But Seth is exactly that force that always threatens the bureaucratic state. It's the usurping force. And so the Egyptians knew in their mythos that the attentive eye, the eye of the falcon, right, and that's the bird's eye view, was the antidote to the totalitarian proclivity. And the Mesopotamians knew this too, because their god Marduk, who was the top god and also the model for the proper emperor, had eyes all the way around his head. And they knew that it wasn't intellect that was the antidote to the totalitarian state, not this narrow left hemisphere intellect, let's say. It was the capacity for attention that we seem to be focusing on when discussing right hemisphere function.
There's a couple of ways in which one can see the eye of Horus, and one is in the benign way that you do, and the other is as the sort of somewhat predatory, all-seeing eye, the disembodied eye. And one day I want to write about this, because it's something, an enormous number of Egyptian symbols, including the disembodied eye, come up in the artwork of patients with schizophrenia who don't know anything about Egyptology.
I would love to talk about that.
One day I'm going to write a book about that.
Well, the Egyptians, well, good, that's something else we can talk about. The Egyptians knew this too, because for them, the optimal pharaoh, so the principle of sovereignty, wasn't the eye of Horus. It was the eye of Horus having revitalized Osiris, who was the spirit of the state. And so Horus gives one of his eyes to Osiris. Osiris is his dead father. So their union, so they knew
it's a very complex thing, and
it is.
Yeah. But how did we get onto the eye of Horus? I've forgotten.
Oh, well, we were talking about the potential redemptive value of attention.
Attention. Oh, yes, my goodness.
Exactly. Yes, and the fight of attention against arrogant intellectual totalitarian presumption.
Yes, and I just want to sort of say something very briefly about purpose, that people may think, oh dear, he thinks that, as it were, there's an engineering god who's sort of got it all, the deistic vision, that God wound up the universe and let it go, or can occasionally move into the clockwork. That's not what I mean at all. I mean that there is some purpose that is transcendent, that is sacred, and is not deterministic, which is a really important point to make. Anyway,
I think the
there's a
science
talk for
points in
another
that.
day.
Well, I think the science points in that direction too, Iain. So
Yes.
that's another place where we can be really hard-headed about this. You know, I talked to Roger Penrose about this because Penrose does not believe that consciousness itself is reducible to an algorithm or computational. And he believes it, I believe, on grounds that from the physics perspective are similar to the, what would you say? They come from the same conceptual universe as the ideas that you're propounding in relationship to the idea of consciousness at the forefront of, let's say, the revelation of possibility, something like that. So nobody can come up at, let's say, and criticize the ideas that we're discussing, you and I, by saying, well, the biology doesn't point in that direction and neither does the physics. It's like, no, the biology points very strongly in this direction and so does the physics.
I mean,
so
it does. I mean, the argument that there is no direction, no drives, no purpose in biology, but it's all simply accidental. I think there must be a few people left in the world who still believe that, but I think it's largely been discredited completely. It's very obvious, in fact, that biology is highly expressive of purpose, but I think even the inanimate universe is as well. And I adopt a rather unusual position, but perhaps we mustn't go there because it will take us for a long time to discuss. But that the inanimate and animate worlds are not totally distinct from one another. Obviously, they are distinct in the sense that they are completely different and have different kinds of qualities, but they're not ultimately divided. They're not ultimately separate. There is a continuum, is the best way of putting it.
I hope you enjoyed that segment. I hope you got something out of it. And remember to stay tuned. Nick and I are going to be going live and talking about this video probably in about a week or so. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure you watch out for that video coming out so we can follow up on this and tie up the loose ends and discuss very thoroughly how this relates to Christianity. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. May the Lord bless you, and good day.